Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Indie Diarist podcast, showing the human stories behind indie game development. Speaking to you today is your loyal Indie Diarist and host, Anthony L. Wolf, writer, narrative designer, senior content manager for social media, all the things that you guys already know. And I'm speaking to you today just with a little announcement or refresher if you've listened to the other episodes from earlier this month, which is that now there's a whole new way to support the show. As of August, the Ko-fi and Patreon pages for the Indie Diarist are now live, and you can find them by going to theindiediarist.com and clicking on the direct links, or going to patreon.com or ko-fi.com/The Indie Diarist without spaces or dashes. My Patreon tiers start from as little as $2.50, but for this very first month, as we are halfway through August, I'm running a special 50% discount off all tiers, and you can subscribe from as little as £1.25 or about $2 per month. And with that, you gain access to episodes in advance, plus a lot more. Without further ado, let's dive head straight into this episode, which is Footnote number 2, my second ever bonus episode. And for this one, I wanted to do something really special. I asked Josh from Still Loading podcast to jump on the show to discuss the origins and rise of indie games and what they mean for video game culture. Now, Josh is just an amazing individual and now officially one of the pals of the show, and this is my first ever podcast collab, which is something that you will also hear very shortly. But thank you so much, Josh, for being such an amazing guest, and I'm sure we can do even more together in the future. So yeah, I'll just leave you to the episode now. Please enjoy, and do feel free to reach out to either of us to let us know what you thought of this nice little collab. Alright, hello everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the Indie Diarist podcast. Today with you is your loyal Indie Diarist, Anthony L. Wolf, writer, narrative designer, and senior content manager for social media. And this is the second Footnote episode, which is my series of special episodes. And for this one, I wanted to do something very, very special and have the first podcast collaboration ever in the history of the Indie Diarist. And so today with me is Josh from Still Loading. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Josh, and say a little bit about your podcast. And then for your listeners, maybe I'll say a few things about myself.
Dude, first off, I'm honored to be your first podcast collab. So thank you so much for inviting me on the show. I've been looking forward to this since we kind of set this whole thing up. Also looking forward to chatting about, I don't know if, can I say what the topic is? I don't know if it's, I guess it's in the show title.
It's good to be in the show title. Yeah.
I'm excited to talk about indie games. I don't know. I didn't know how much you wanted to bury the lead or what. I don't know. But no, thank you for inviting me on. I've been looking forward to this. And yeah, so Still Loading, I kind of describe it as a gaming grab bag podcast. It does a little bit of everything. I do deep dives on individual games. I focus a lot on game history and within my retrospectives. But then I also have interviews with people in the industry. Like I've interviewed voice actors and some game devs, both indie and actually, has it been any AAA? I guess technically I've done like one AAA dev and the rest have been indie. And I've interviewed other composers. So I've interviewed composers, actually most of them for indie games, which is kind of appropriate for your show. So yeah, I kind of do a little bit of everything. If I had to shout out a couple things specifically that I always like to highlight in case someone wants to check out my show. If you like Final Fantasy, I did an episode called the Final Fantasy Fantasy Draft, which is what happens when you take fantasy sports and Final Fantasy and mash them up together. Had a lot of fun with that. And I would say at the time this probably comes out, actually, yeah, because my next episode is coming out tomorrow. The episode that is actually about to drop the day after we record this for the Famicom 40th anniversary, the Famicom/Nintendo Entertainment System. I really enjoyed doing that episode, and so it kind of gives a good snippet of like a good range of like some goofier things that aren't so much history focused, and then some things that are very heavily history focused, which were with a touch of inappropriate humor.
Well, I did see you share things about the Famicom and all of that on your Twitter profile recently, so it looks like you were getting ready to drop that episode. But yeah, so and I think one way I would describe Josh's podcast is it's a podcast on video game culture, really. That's the main thing that pushed me to actually get in touch and see, okay, let's see what we can do with this. And just in case some listeners from Still Loading are listening to this episode as well, the Indie Diarist is a podcast on the human stories behind indie game development. So it's entirely focused on indie game development. Every episode I have different studios or different game developers just coming to the on the podcast and telling their stories to me, but also via me, they're telling them to you. So yeah, and if I had to shout out to one episode in particular, is the very first Footnote, which is right before this one, Footnote number 1, which was with the narrative designer of Outer Wilds, Kelsey Beecham, and that was a splendid episode indeed. But
I've been meaning to listen to that one because, dude, I love Outer Wilds. I mentioned to you when we chatted off mic a little while ago about how like I'm just blown away by the storytelling in that game. So I haven't had a chance to sit down and listen to it, but I'm planning on listening to it very soon. I'm very interested in that episode.
Perfect. So you have Josh's interest as well. So yeah, go check it out. But yeah, so I think we can dive straight into the episode because we have a pretty packed outline, and it's going to be an interesting one. This one. So I thought we could come together to talk about the impact of indie games on video game culture and indie game. And just when I say indie games, I mention mostly. I'm referring mostly to the golden age, the rise of indie games after Steam exploded in a way, because we know that, of course, all games were indies before they were a commercial success. But I guess we'll get into it just now. So I think this is relevant personally because indie games are very topical right now. The publishers from all over the world and of all sizes are just investing heavily in these independent little teams and just giving them a lot of support, even if they primarily publish AAA games. So there's clearly market interest for it. This is clearly a cultural moment for video games as as indie games reach their maturity. And so I think we can talk about how that happened and where we're headed next. So I think we can start by talking about the origins of indie games and their roots in the industry. So let's have a little bit of a free discussion around that. And I think it's important to note, and even though I have already mentioned it, that indie games, the label indie, is going to be probably discussed a lot during this episode because there are different ways to describe what an indie is.
I feel like that is a very complicated definition to make because because if you look like, for example, Minecraft, arguably the most successful indie game of all time, but is it really indie anymore now that it's been bought by Microsoft? Yeah. I would say no, but it was indie at one point in time. So I think like one of the things in doing research for this episode, both in some of the wonderful research you did, like you sent me so many links that was very helpful. But one thing that I think is a interesting, maybe not narrative, but thing to think about is like, when does an indie developer transition into becoming AAA? Like I would argue there's been very few in recent memory of indie developers that have transitioned into AAA, with the exception of like Minecraft once again, but that was also bought by Microsoft, so kind of. But like if you look, like I'm sure there's other examples that I can't think of, but the last one I could think of is like the id guys, like id Software, that back with in shareware and all that other stuff. Those were indie devs, but now they're AAA devs. But when did that transition actually happen? I don't know. I feel like it. I don't know if we're going to be able to even answer it over the course of our conversation this episode. But like, when does an indie dev become AAA? Like, what level of success is too great in order to not be considered indie anymore? And that's a really weird thought to have, And
I think, having spoken to a lot of developers, and I even know a few who have been published by Devolver Digital, for example, who's this huge indie publisher, of course. Of course, there are conflicting views there. There are people who still see themselves as indie because there's very minimal interference in terms of the creative process from the publisher. But also, once you have the kind of support and you have the kind of funding and the money, are you still indie? Are you a triple I or a double A or something like that? There are those terms that have been discussed in the past. But yeah, I think one very important thing to say already now from the start is that I think indies have always been around, as you mentioned, like transitioning from Doom in the 1993, I think it was released, to now being AAA for its software. They were indie at some point. It's just there wasn't Steam around, so indies never really left. They are the foundation of the medium in a way, and it's something that even someone like Bennett Foddy, who's the creator of Getting Over It, and also multi-year designer with multi-year experience and such, he says very loud and proud. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have. Well, of course, I suppose you will have some memories from the early 90s and such. Of course, I was born in 95, so I'm kind of young.
Well, I was born in 89, so I don't really have a lot of memories of the shareware era of game history. I will say it's interesting to think about. I think the comment you made about it was kind of, I think it's a little bit easy to gloss over, but I think it's super important. So I want to kind of like circle around on it. Indie games are the foundation of the industry. That is, I think that's something that not a lot of people really realize, and something I didn't quite even realize. But if you think about it, before AAA publishers or devs even existed, everything was indie because the industry wasn't an industry. It was just a bunch of enthusiasts who wanted to make something amazing.
Yeah, like a lot of games at the beginning were sold by mail order without even a retailer in the 80s. So yeah, that was just how the industry was born.
Selling them through your local store through Ziploc baggies and little printouts and stuff like that. Like, and the thing is, even what is it? Even on like the Atari 2600, right? The Atari VCS, that thing. Yes, there were AAA ish teams, like Activision obviously became that, but it really wasn't initially. It was a bunch of like Atari, not rejects, but Atari defectors. That's the word I'm looking for. They defected from Atari because Atari treated them like crap. So it's kind of interesting that like one of the first like third party developers started up was because of AAA not treating their employees well. And I almost feel like indie is kind of a similar indie games is kind of a similar thing. Obviously there's hobbyists who get into it, but there's a lot of indie devs. What is it? There's a guy named Tony Barnes who's worked in the industry since the 90s. He worked on like the Jungle Strike games for like the Genesis and whatnot. He worked on in terms of AAA stuff, somewhat more recent, granted it's over a decade, but the Medal of Honor 2010 reboot, he worked on that. Dude's been in the industry for years. He has his own indie studio now called Retro Ninja because he's tired of working for the AAA space because of how AAA companies treat people, treat employees. So it is interesting how it's kind of a little bit of a cyclical thing where, Atari treated their employees like crap, wouldn't let them credit themselves in their own games for like, F you, we're going to start our own company. And now we have Activision. Activision is its own little thing, but we're not going to go into that.
Let's not. It's probably not.
But like even the
first moment,
one of the things he sent me, I forget which YouTuber it was, but in the video, he made a really good point. Like, what's the first indie game? Arguably, it's Pong, or arguably, if you go even back, it's like Tennis for Two or whatever.
I think the video was called, just for our listeners' reference, it was probably the one about the spirit of indie games. And while you talk, I'm going to try and find it again because that was really useful.
But like that's technically like the first indie game because it wasn't developed. It was just developed by a bunch of people, and they were like, "Oh, this was cool," and then it ended up taking off. There's even other stuff where like someone made, I forget who told me about this. It might have been Kevin Bunch, who does a lot of work with Atari. He has a YouTube channel called Atari Archive, and it's all about studying the history of Atari in that era of game history, like mid to late 70s, early 80s. And he might have been the one that told me this, but I can't remember. But there is a guy who made for, maybe it might have even been for like Atari computers or something like that. But to teach himself how to program, he made like a version of Monopoly, or I might not have even been Monopoly. I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on a lot of the specifics of this story, but essentially he turned a popular board game into a video game, and into a video game version of it to teach himself how to program. And there might have been someone else who told me about this too, but and then it ended up being insanely popular, and he had no idea because of just distribution methods. There's no way, like, it just kind of took off. I don't know. It's just it's a wild thing to think about, like the evolution of indie games throughout the industry, where they are kind of the foundation of the industry, but they're also kind of the unsung heroes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even now.
Yeah, because I think there are a couple of reasons for that, and also interesting that the guy you mentioned, he's worked on a board game and converting it into a game. I don't know if you know the book called The Art of Game Design, and that book argues that a lot of board games can teach you game design even better than video games themselves, because they're just so complicated as systems. But I think going back to the problem of the unsung heroes and such, I think there's one actually, I like both of his books right now. Jason Schreier, the reporter from Bloomberg, and his second book, which is Press Reset, that dives into what happens when a game flops in the AAA scene. And usually that means, if you're a small studio, that you either experience a bunch of layoffs, or you just get bought or just absorbed by the publisher to just do something else. And still, your studio usually goes through a bunch of layoffs anyway, because all it takes is one failed game for these studios that just work under big publishers and spend millions of in budget on games that then maybe end up being a flop. So that's probably why a lot of indies still prefer today to work independently, because they know that is a possibility, they know that could happen, and they know that it's just not worth the risk and the financial insecurity, even though being indie is just as financial insecure as maybe working in AAA on one game for 3 years. So yeah, there are a lot of different sides to this story, but I'm sure we're going to dive into them pretty soon. I think one important thing that I realized, and I didn't really think about it until I read it, is that even the shareware market, basically, a lot of developers were working for bigger companies. So there were, some were just putting a demo out and then just like Doom. But Doom itself, like the developers of Doom themselves, they just work with another company. I think it was Apogee Software that just put the demo online, and then they could download Commander Keen or all of that.
Apogee is the one that invented the shareware model.
Exactly,
So it's like they may have worked with another company, but I still would consider that kind of indie for the time, because it wasn't like there wasn't like an Activision or EA, which both existed at the time, or they didn't get published via some of the big companies. They kind of did it all themselves. You know, it still is an impressive thing. And I guess what's interesting too is like when, like, if you think back even to like the era prior to that, you know, NES, Sega Master System, or the SG-1000, like what constitutes an indie versus, in my estimation, there wasn't really indie devs at all for those systems. They were all quote unquote AAA, but why? Like it could have been a company that started up and just paid Nintendo to put their stuff on their system. Like what constitutes an indie game in that era? Like I feel like almost the definition of indie game changes depending on the era that you're in. So like in the 90s, a lot of the shareware ones, we don't think of them as indie devs now, but arguably they were, because they were having to self-publish everything. I feel like self-publishing is almost like a guaranteed definite, like no matter what era, if you self-publish your game, no matter the size, arguably you're indie. So I mean, that's just my personal opinion. I'm not saying that as a definitive statement. Because by that logic,
kind of makes sense though. A lot of like indie authors, even just in other industries and sectors, indie writers, they usually are the ones who self-publish. But even then, even in that sector in publishing, there are still indie indie fiction publishing houses and such.
Yeah.
So you still have indie publishers.
Yes, and that's not to say
pick up those people. So
exactly, and that's not to say any dev who gets published, even by AAA, because technically, what is it? Journey from that game company is an indie game, but it was published by Sony. Sony financed that game, but it's still technically considered an indie. So indie is such a weird, nebulous title definition, like I said at the beginning, and to kind of tie it in with, I feel like I've kind of sidetracked the conversation with kind of talking about this idea of an indie, but to tie that into the history thing, what you wanted to start off with, is that's why I say like the definition of indie I feel changes from era to era. Like what's an indie back in like the 90s might not be considered an indie now, depending on
I think even now that's a great point, because I think even now we're seeing that shift again. Because after Steam, and we'll get into that just very shortly, but after Steam kind of exploded and allowed people to just self-publish games on the platform, then that point there were more small teams with tight budgets and such just publishing a lot of games. But then regardless of success, they could be defined as indies. But then now we have, again, publishers trying to tap into that market and that and that kind of shifting consumer trends, and so that the indie term is changing again. So I think what I like to stick with when it comes to defining some game or studio as indie is something made by small team, usually no more than 15 people, and with usually tight budget and with a relative creative freedom. But now the problem with creative freedom is that it's very difficult to define how much of that was really freedom.
Well,
and
so with that in mind, though, would technically a game like Death Stranding be considered indie because Sony didn't?
That's the problem. Yeah, exactly.
Like I would argue no, because there's already so many connections and it was such a big budget. But at the same time, it kind of is, because it wasn't like it was self-published, right? It was published by Kojima's own company. That's a weird like in the middle where it's like it's technically like it has all the dressings of an indie developed game, but none of the the backing of it, like the finances and like triple like big Hollywood actors and crap like that. Like it's such a weird thing. But I think I kind of misspoke in what I was saying. Like I wasn't necessarily trying to say like we'll never know. I kind of think the interesting thing about this conversation is, well, how can I say this? I'm trying to say the interesting thing that we can explore throughout this conversation, exploring through the history of indie games, and then the rise of indie games in the, specifically in like 2009 to like 2016, like that kind of era, is the definition of an indie game is so hard to define, but it's kind of fun to kind of leave it ambiguous because it leaves conversations this open. And exactly. I'm sorry. So the basic outline from my understanding of like the like indie games is like technically everything was indie at the beginning, and then you kind of had the rise of shareware in like the late 80s, early 90s, and then starting in 2004-ish is where you started seeing a little bit more self-published. I'm thinking there's a game called like Cave Story that came out in like 2004. And then in 2007 or 8, I think it might have been 2008, maybe 9, when Braid came out. Like specifically the moment Braid went big on the Xbox Live Arcade is kind of like the indie boom that we know it as now. And it hasn't really slowed down. Like it's changed and isn't quite the same thing as it once was before, but for all intents and purposes, like that's where the indie boom really started once Braid just hit it big. Braid and Super Meat Boy and that kind of thing.
And actually, I'm very interested in that gap, because every time I think about, there was the shareware market, and then we jumped to Steam. But there's that gap in this kind of indie story that seems to start when, like, at the beginning of the 90s or something. And because then console gaming maybe made AAA more relevant. But why? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Why do you think that happened?
I mean, I can't say for certain why. I mean, shareware was still pretty big even into the mid 90s. Doom came out in what, 92, 93?
92, 93, I think
93,
it was.
Something like that.
93, yeah.
So it like Doom was there, and then Quake obviously was a little less shareware, but Quake was also huge. Actually, no, there was a shareware version of Quake, but stuff like that, like shareware was a thing well into the 90s. I would say the gap that you kind of see in like the mid to late 90s is just that it I'm sure there was, and I'm sure there was indie games that people could point out that like not a lot of people know about or are super obscure. I would say a lot of the indie devs though, or a lot of the indie games that you would see kind of grew out of the internet, like Flash games, Newgrounds. I mean, you have varying points of quality in those,
of course,
but that's not even any shade, because a lot of them were like meant to be jokes. Like I have a friend who, shout out to Keith over at the Main Quest podcast on his Patreon. I haven't been able to listen to one of these episodes yet, but on his Patreon, he has a series called In a Flash, and it's all about reviewing Newgrounds games from the 90s. And some of them are incredibly offensive, like because it was, early 2000s humor. And so I feel like a lot of indie games started coming out of that because of ease of access. It was a lot easier to make games for Newgrounds than it was to get your game published on a PC and figure out the internet, like incredibly so democratized indie distribution and made it a lot easier for people to do it. And then it kind of ended up reversing, because like the first people in that got hits, that's great. It's the same thing even with like shareware. The first people who got shareware, great. But eventually what happens is once something works, then it gets saturated in the market, and it's impossible to really make yourself stand out unless you have and it's not even just indie games. It could be for anything, but you need consistency, you need quality, you need a whole bunch of stuff. But it's not even just in gaming, like it being an indie dev, like in any form of media, like content creation, whether you're a YouTuber, a Twitch streamer, a podcaster, like it's a bizarre combination of skill and luck, because unless you were the first ones there to like ride the wave, you are hoping that someone will find you in the mass of everything that's thrown at you, because we have everything that's thrown at us. And the same thing happens for indie devs. One of the common complaints I was reading about, it was great, Xbox Live was fantastic, all of a sudden we have this outlet in order to push our games to the public so we can have people play our games. And then
they screwed up massively.
I would even say, like, I don't know the ins and outs of it. I know they screwed up massively, but I think I think they were set up to fail a little bit. And it's not 100%. Like, the thing that everyone knows about digital distribution is discoverability is can I swear on this? Or
yeah, of course. Yeah, sure.
It's fucking bullshit. That's the issue. Because you can't, when you look at a marketplace, a digital marketplace, you have to search for a specific title, or it has to be the algorithm has to push that in through like your recommendations or put it on the front search page, because that's how more people will get their eyes on it. But if you don't have the connections with the people who run the storefront, or you get bad algorithmic luck, there's a whole bunch of things. Like, discoverability is awful unless you get help from the people running the storefronts, whether it be Steam, whether it be Microsoft, whether it be Sony, whether it be Nintendo. You need help from that. Otherwise, you're relying almost purely on word of mouth and luck. And that's not to say it doesn't happen. Look at Among Us. That was a game that released like a couple years prior to it blowing up in 2020. 2018, I want to say it came out, or 2019.
I think it was just before the pandemic, because then that's when it exploded. So I think it was 2018.
And it just so happened it took off, and it blew up, and it became this massive, huge success for the company that was not prepared to handle that massive, huge success.
Yeah. Yeah, and same for Fall Guys. During the pandemic, Fall Guys became huge, and then it kind of deflated. But it's still beloved in like Twitch and by content creators and such. But yeah, you made a great point in terms of market saturation there, because it's the allure of money, isn't it? It's you see that there's a chance to make somewhat easy money, but there's an easier chance to make money than what you're doing now. So you jump on board, and then all of a sudden everybody is there, and the market gets saturated, and it becomes a mess. So yeah, it's totally true, and that's exactly what happened with Xbox Live Arcade at some point. After the release of Super Meat Boy and Braid and Fez, everybody wanted to jump on that ship, and then Microsoft kind of potentially made a bunch of bad choices there, and the ball went in Sony's court, who was able to capitalize it with PS3 on and that era over there, and then also PS4 and so on. But yeah, that's there's also one thing about indies around that early noughties, which is that AAAs were getting super expensive, and they weren't very much willing to take risks, which is still very much a thing today in some cases.
It's too expensive.
And so indies, millions in budget just to make a game. And that means that indies had smaller teams had more freedom and willpower, and the lack of resources to have the resources to experiment a bit more, which means there were new experiences being born, and that's what we saw with Braid, Super Meat Boy, and Fez, which coincidentally kind of all came out around the same time.
And it has a really great documentary all about their development. Indie
Game the movie. Yeah,
fantastic movie.
Indeed. Yeah,
and it'll make you love and hate the devs. You'll love some, you'll hate others. I'm not going to say who. Yeah,
I think we all know who. Yeah.
If you watch it, you probably know who you end up not liking. But you never know. But I believe one of them, the dude who made one of the guys who made Super Meat Boy, Edmund, I want to say his name.
Edmund McMillen. Yeah,
Edmund McMillen went on to make the Binding of Isaac games, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly. Yeah,
it's interesting to see what. I think what's fascinating about indie games is that simultaneously the lack of resources and all that other stuff, while it is a huge hindrance, it is a huge creative boon to them. Limitations breed creativity. That's why a lot of older games, when you have to work around limitations, you find much more creative solutions. I'm not saying that's always going to be the case, but like by and large, most creatives that I speak to agree that limitations breed creativity. So there's that element. Also, like you said, Anthony, perfect. I mean, I agree 100% because of you have less overhead to worry about. You can afford to be riskier with your game design ideas, and arguably that's where, like, if you really think about it, the biggest. Actually, you know what? Yeah. Two of the biggest genres to come out within the last like 10 or 12 years are from indie games. MOBAs was from Dota, from an indie mod for Warcraft 3, which then spawned into its own genre of games called MOBAs.
Yeah.
That's yes, technically it's not an indie game, but it's an indie developer who modded an existing game engine to make the thing. I consider that an indie.
I think mods do qualify as indie. It kind of
skirts the line a little bit, yes, but like I still think it was an indie, or it has indie origins at the very least. And then
the other one, I think you're thinking about battle royales, aren't you?
Or what? Sorry.
Battle Royale.
Yes,
the genre,
100%.
Came out of wasn't it the Culling? I think it was the Culling that.
I thought it was PUBG originally. Was PUBG not PUBG? Is PUBG AAA?
No, it's also indie. But the Culling also it was the same concept. It was kind of a Hunger Games indie game.
Okay. Which
had the same concept as PUBG, but PUBG made it bigger with a bigger map and such. But the Culling was pretty much like Hunger Games. You had the gas zone that kind of closed in, and we see that in Fortnite and Warzone and that whole new genre that was simply born out of two indie games, which were the Culling and PUBG, which kind of came out at the same time, if I remember right. So again, for some reason, they cross-contaminated each other, and then something interesting was born. But there's also another pretty important milestone, which is around the time Braid came out, which is in 2008 and 2009, and I believe this is respectively, Kickstarter and Indiegogo were launched, which means crowdfunding, which means people trying to get funding for their games and not having to worry about finding a publisher anymore. And so we saw the likes of, well, Hollow Knight more recently, but I'm sure I can't think of one specific title right now, but I'm sure there were some early indies around that time that were funded using Kickstarter.
Yeah, I mean, well, the infamous one is Mighty Number 9 because it.
Oh yeah, there you go, Mighty Number. Yeah, the infamous.
The infamous one is Mighty Number 9. But I mean, like, there's lots of indie games. I can't think of like an early example, like Mighty Number 9 era of early. But if you're thinking of like recently, I can't remember the name of the game, but there's a new game from the same developers who made Suikoden the Suikoden games on PS1.
Yeah, that's true.
Fully funded through crowdfunding. Obviously, the Sea of Stars game from the people who made The Messenger, I believe it's from the same dev. Also got oh my gosh, why can't I think of the composer's name? It's the same composer who did Chrono Trigger. It's Yoshinori Mitsuda, I want to say. I'll look it up real quick while I'm talking. But yeah, so like the dude, it's crazy what they've been able, like what crowdfunding is able to do. But the problem is that as kind of with any lucrative business model, there's going to be grifters. That's
a big problem.
There's lots of times where, unfortunately, people will, say, "Hey, I'm making this game," and then it's not actually in progress at all, type of thing. So, and sorry, yes, it is Yoshinori Mitsuda, who also worked with Nobuo Uematsu on the soundtrack a little bit as well.
All right.
So, and yeah, it's kind of cool to see that he is working on what is supposed to be the spiritual successor. Well, not supposed to be, but what is a spiritual successor to kind of Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana and all that other stuff. But anyway.
There's another example that comes to mind, which is, well, of course, Mighty Number 9, the original creator of Mega Man, just trying to get indie and such.
I mean, the game did come out, but it still was pretty bad. Some people still have not gotten their copies of that, even though it's like over a decade now.
Oh, I didn't know that, but yeah, that's bad. There's another example. I'm pretty sure, and I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Shenmue 3 was also funded on Kickstarter. And like, Shenmue 1 and 2, I don't think they were indie at all. No. So Kickstarter just gave rise to this new wave of just people from even having maybe some AAA experience, wanting to do their own thing, completely detached from any kind of publisher and wanting to be their own bosses. But of course, all of this at some point was fueled by Steam, who needed a platform to just keep Half-Life up to date and host the source mods and such, and Counter-Strike and whatnot. And that became like a digital storefront and it exploded. I believe the first non-Valve game, and I've written this down, the first non-Valve game to land on Steam was Ragdoll Kung Fu.
I thought it was Darwinia.
It was together with Darwinia, but Darwinia was after Ragdoll Kung Fu, just slightly after. And then Cave Story, World of Goo, and all of those just kind of landed on the platform. But what I want to do now is and the listeners won't be able to see it, but I want to share just very briefly what I'm looking at right now, which is a graph of indie game releases from 2008 up until today. And you can see two very important milestones there, or two important moments, which are Steam Greenlight and Steam Direct. So Steam Greenlight, I don't know if you remember what it was, but essentially it was this program where you would submit your game on Steam, and people would be able to vote on it, and whether they wanted it to come to fruition and stuff. But there were some downsides to Steam Greenlight. It wasn't a perfect system, so it got replaced in 2017 by Steam Direct, which is basically pay a fee and get published.
Well, if I remember correctly, it's because they didn't require a fee at all.
Exactly.
And while that, most people are like, that's amazing, what a great thing. You're right, that is amazing, but people can also not be the best. And so there was a whole bunch of games that would just get published
shovelware.
For like, it's not even shovelware, it's sewerware. It's like you could go even lower than that.
Yeah.
It was stuff that it would just be like, escape this room, and you can never actually escape the room. You're just trapped. Like someone literally just designed like a white box, and that's their game. You paid money.
There was
that.
a lot of crap. Yeah, yeah.
So.
And of course the listeners won't be able to see this chart, but if you go onto SteamDB, you can see this chart for yourself in the indie section, in the category. But basically, there's that moment where Steam Greenlight just got launched in 2012, and I think it was August 2012, and then from then, indies started to rise. But then the biggest bump was when Steam Direct got released, which actually is in 2017, which is, I believe, around the same time when Hollow Knight and another wave of incredible indies was released. So from then on, basically, indies went from, on Steam, and this is on Steam alone, not counting other platforms, but indies went from being 970 in 2014, published in 2014, to being 6,273 in 2018. So about 4 years later. And I think that's crazy. So
that's a huge
I'm going to stop
jump.
sharing this one, but I want to comment this thing with you. Like, what do you think? What are your thoughts when you see something like that?
I think it was a perfect storm of stuff, and I don't mean storm in a bad way. I think it's wonderful that there's so many indie games being developed, because not every game's going to speak to me, and that's fine. But so that's when I say middling quality. There are some that are objectively, like, doesn't matter if you like it or dislike it. They're just bad games, and that's no offense to the devs either. Making a game is hard. Making a game is really hard. Yeah. I went to school for game design, and I couldn't hack it. Like, I'm just saying that right now. Like, it's a tough job. When I say that, I hope it doesn't come off as like I don't know. I don't want to belittle anyone's work, because it's a lot of work to put into a game.
Yeah.
With that said, it makes me very happy to see that, because even with the glut of both, thankfully, a lot of great, phenomenal indie games and some not so great ones, I think when I mentioned before it was a perfect storm, it's because if you think about it, you think about 2008, 2009, right?
Mm-hmm.
Indie games are first taking off. If you think about kids in 2008 and 2009, maybe they're 10 or 12 years old, right? Something like that. They grow up and go to college. They're starting to leave college or are in college around 2018. And they're starting to like take game design seriously. And they're no longer 10 or 12 year olds. They're now, either they're young adults, late teens, early 20s. And they're starting to make their own set of games. So I think it was this perfect storm of, like, right when those kids were coming of age in order that they could break into to the industry at all, whether it be AAA or otherwise. Steam has this thing where, like, you can publish on our platform, and it's very easy to develop for PC compared to having to port it to, Switch or PS5 or Xbox Series
Well, you also
X.
need the development kits, which are pretty expensive.
Yes, so, and versus for Steam, you pay the fee, which I don't know if it still is this. I remember for a while it was just $100, which
I think it's still $100,
which is so, like, that is outrageously affordable compared to, like, what it is to get your game approved on, like, by one of the big consoles. So it's awesome. So I think it's this perfect storm.
It is $100.
It's still $100. Yep. That's amazing.
Still $100. Yeah.
So think about it. It's this perfect storm of a bunch of kids growing up with indie games, being like, "Oh, this was a game that someone made in their house. Like, they didn't have to, like, get hired by a studio that I know. They can just do this." That's a very freeing idea. That's a very freeing realization for a kid to have. And so the kids who were serious about it stayed serious about it, and they kept on, working it for themselves, like figuring out how to make games. And so now they're leaving college, and what do you know? Steam suddenly has this amazing program that just allows you to publish games on their platform.
And add to that the fact that basically around this time, because of all the indie games that were being published, there was also increased awareness of just what the indie market could do. So, like, Hollow Knight around 2017 and Stardew Valley, and of course earlier than that, all the games that we mentioned. So Minecraft, the ultimate indie game that made millions of dollars, and Fez, Braid, Super Meat Boy, The Stanley Parable. I don't know how much The Stanley Parable did, but it was insanely popular at the time as well.
It was pretty influential, to say the least. I remember even I remember seeing when that came out, like a lot of people were talking about it because no one had played a game quite like that yet. What indies do are just incredible, man. Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, no. Sorry, I cut you off. But basically, plus add to that Unity and Epic kind of capitalized on this new wave.
And made Unity free. I don't know if Epic is.
Yeah. I'm not sure about Unreal Engine, but I think it is free. I think it is free. But yeah, there was wider availability of development tools. Accessing the market was easier than ever because of Steam and Greenlight and all of that. There was this... Also, this was around this time, as you mentioned, all those kids out of school or just those that maybe had been in games for a long time, they were starting to share their knowledge online as well. So YouTube tutorials and all those communities of indie devs coming together. And so you had this huge expansion of digital distribution platforms, plus the communities of indie devs just sharing knowledge with each other, development tools being easy to access, market access being easier than ever because of Steam and even PlayStation aiming to publish more indies, Xbox Live Arcade and all of those. So indie games just exploded, and they haven't stopped since then. It's still going. So yeah, it's I think it's amazing. It's impressive what happened in the past few years.
And now, arguably, indie games are some of the most anticipated titles when it comes to new releases coming now. Like, it's don't get me wrong, I almost feel like there is like indie, and then there's like AAA indie. Might sound a little insulting because I don't want to, like, indie games, I feel like it's a very, like, you know, it's a very almost a little bit of a hipster mentality. Like, I'm not AAA, man. I'm part of the I'm part of the indie scene. But there are bigger indie devs. Like, look at Yacht Club Games. Like, I love Shovel Knight to pieces, and they have. Is Mina the Hollower out, or is it coming out? I don't know. That was their that's their next game. It's like a Zelda clone.
I think it's coming out, but I'm not sure. I'd have to double check.
Okay, so but you know, they're a big, because Shovel Knight did so well. They're kind of essentially what happens is, like, if you have that one hit game, it can really set you up for a long while. And look at like Eric Barone with Stardew Valley. Yeah, that game,
one person, that's insane.
I mean, he even not trying to insult him, but he also had assistants. Like, yes, he made everything himself, but his girlfriend, I don't know if they're married now or not, but his partner, she supported him the entire time. He didn't bring any money in. So, and he credits that. That is not any shade thrown at him. That still is a monumental thing to do what he did. But he did have a lot of help with it. So it's like, yes, he built everything on his own, but he didn't really make the game on his own. And he's, from what I've read, he's like the first to even admit that. But even, sorry, I don't know why I decided to clarify that, but even with that said, like, that game has made him so much money that he's now able to do so much more with what he wants to do. It's really awesome.
And I can tell that he still has that passion, because he's working on, I think it's something like Chocolatier or something like that. Anyway, something that has to do with chocolate.
The Haunted Chocolatier, I think.
The Haunted Chocolatier, yeah. And he keeps expanding Stardew Valley, and he did the mobile port recently where he put multiplayer in it. So yeah, it's just pretty amazing, pretty incredible. And also that's what I wanted to say about Shovel Knight. I believe it even had its own amiibo at some point. Like, it was the first non-Nintendo character to have an amiibo. That's how big it was, Shovel Knight, and it was an indie. So yeah, that was pretty cool. But yeah, so I think that brings us to today and what indie games are today, and actually the core topic of this talk, and we're going to go well over 1 hour, and I'm aware of that, so don't worry. But the core topic of this chat is the impact of indie games on video game culture. So personally, I see there's because of maybe that hipster mentality and that kind of wanting to be different, but also wanting to be a lot more I want to say empathetic, but it's not necessarily the right word. I think indie games carry a lot of humanity with
Yes.
them. So they created, in what I can see, vibrant, passionate player communities. They're very much passionate about indie games. Just look at us, the two of us, just speaking about them with a lot of enthusiasm. And there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way. And by the way, The Plucky Squire is definitely one of my most anticipated games of this year. And I'd say it's probably more double A or triple I than indie because of Devolver and all of that. But still, it's
I was just sorry. Finish what you were saying. I cut you off.
No, but what I was just going to say is that I think indie games today are creating a lot of spaces for inclusivity, selflessness, acceptance, representation, awareness, things, niche interests even. Like, you can really find an indie game that resonates with you no matter who you are. And I think that's really special. But yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I agree with you. And just to clarify it before, because a lot of times people use hipster in a derogatory sense, and I don't mean it that way in this instance. I mean it more just kind of because the hipster in a derogatory sense generally means like as soon as something becomes popular, automatically is bad. Not everyone's like that, and I'm not even saying that about indie devs. I meant hipster more just like you like being an indie almost feels like you're part of a community, you know?
Yeah,
like you're kind of like your own community of outsiders type of thing, which is a really like great feeling to have when you can find that community. But to tie that in with what you said, I agree. It's indie games. I think what the impact that they've had on game culture as a whole is in the best possible way. It has what's the word I'm looking for? It has like, I can't think of the word. I know I had the word a second ago, but basically if the game industry prior to the indie boom was very homogenous, this is now not homogenous. You know, it's much more spread out, and arguably AAA has gotten even more samey over the years just because the budgets have ballooned so much. And I think what indie devs really do, the big benefit to indie devs, take out the runaway successes that spawn massive series, you know, like the battle royale stuff with PUBG or like Minecraft or stuff like that. But look at just indie games that exist on their own. It didn't spawn some massive money making genre that Epic Games now owns like fucking like everything. But like I think what is amazing about indie games is, like you said, they're able to create communities where none existed prior. Like the amount of like, I feel like it can speak to people where they're at, where AAA studios can't do that because the money is too high. They can't afford to make a giant AAA budget game that appeals to one specific group or audience because it won't make the money back that they spent on it. And indie games can do that. I have a friend over on the Taste of Dragons podcast, which they've been on hiatus for a little bit, but named Troy, where almost all he plays is indie games because the indie games offer the most interesting and varied experiences for him. What was the one that there was that game Unpacking somewhat recently.
Unpacking, it's beautiful.
I haven't played it myself personally, but like I love the idea of that, where it tells a story through what it's a puzzle game, but it's
possessions,
but it's telling a story through the possessions. Like that is beautiful environmental storytelling. And
also the story is compelling too. Like it's the growing up story, and so I won't spoil it for you, but it's very, very compelling. It's very touching too, and you can assume things just by how your possessions change, how you fit things into a space, how you fit into someone else's space, and that kind of stuff. There are a lot of themes and just different design. Great design ideas in there, and I think you would enjoy it very much. Yeah,
that's what I keep hearing. And it also, the indie games in general speak to, I'm hesitant to bring it up because I'm not part of the community, so it would feel like I'm speaking for someone that I have no right speaking for. But with the LGBT plus community, There's a lot of like Life is Strange. I know from my understanding, shouldn't say I
Gone
know.
Home.
Gone Home.
It's,
I'm not part of that community, so I feel absolutely no right speaking on their behalf at all. So it's the only reason I didn't want to call out necessarily specifically, but it is worth bringing up because it has it has given people a community and a voice that they did not have before because of the society that we live in. So it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful what indie games can do. And also it just tells stories that you'll never hear in a AAA studio, in a AAA game.
That's true, yeah.
You'll just never see. Untitled Goose Game would never be made. Granted, we were talking about emotional stories that talk about the human condition, and I brought up the Untitled Goose Game, but you get the
which is a beautiful game, by the way.
It is a beautiful. My personal favorite indie game of all time is Journey for the PS3 from that game company. I know it's a go-to for a lot of people, but it was one of the first ones that I had ever played that I literally had an emotional reaction to. So much so, I actually got Austin Wintory on my podcast a couple of years ago, the composer of the game, to talk about his work on the game, and it was he was a very nice person. I was very grateful to have him on. And it just, I think the way it's really shaped game culture now is that you are able to have these amazing experiences that AAA could not take the risk on ever. And if it does, it generally has to be done in a big budget way. And even then, it's because of how people react online and shit. Sometimes they have to be careful with it. But I'm not going to get into that.
I totally agree. I think the beauty of indie games compared to AAA is that they challenge conventions, they explore new ways of making games, and try to make things innovative in their own way. And again, we mentioned a few examples, but like, as you mentioned, representation is so important for a lot of communities. And I feel like indie games it's kind of like they build that channel of communication, the direct channel of communication between the developer and the player, even more so than AAA games do. Even though some of them now recently tried to do that, like the God of War reboot / sequel from 2018, not Ragnarok, the one before.
Yeah.
I think it speaks to dads a lot. I'm not a dad, but I feel like it speaks to dads and to fathers and sons, and children and such. And I think it does it in a very compelling way. And it takes that risk, and the story that results from it is just beautiful. And I think there are a lot of benefits for indies, especially that tap into those very niche and engaged communities, because those people are going to resonate with your game so much that they're going to find it if you know what you're doing, but they're going to find it, and they're going to like it, and they're going to love it, and they're going to tell their friends about it. And because these communities are very tight, they're going to have other friends who want to play it, and such and such. And so I think Outer Wilds is a great example of a game that just simply by word of mouth became huge, and that's because it just had maybe everything in it. You have a very, very minor thing, but you have, as a pronoun, you have they for the Harthians. They have no gender, and already you can identify with that. You can see yourself in that, but also the quirkiness of the Nomai, the quirkiness of the characters in there, how unique they feel, and the fact that it encourages failure through the story and through its gameplay mechanics. It's just something that I feel like AAAs maybe would be able to pull off, but like that's the main thing I'm worried about. Starfield, when it comes to Starfield, for example, how big is it going to be? How focused is it going to be? Is it going to be quality over quantity? I'm not really sure. It sounds like it's aiming for 1,000 different planets, but I don't know how much depth there's going to be to each of them. Whereas in Outer Wilds, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 planets plus a comet, and you have a beautiful story.
I think though with that specifically, it's almost hard. Like I would almost think it would be dumb. Like, let's say technology be damned, no issue with specs or limitations or hardware limits or any type of coding issues, right? Let's say you could make a game with hundreds of galaxies and they're as in-depth as the one we're in right now. That would be awful. That would be like there'd be too much to do. let's say it doesn't cost billions of dollars and it wouldn't be prohibitively expensive, or the God forbid if there's any like human issues, where I shouldn't say issues, but the human factor of like burnout and crunch and all the awful things that game devs do to their employees. Take all that out of the equation. Let's say none of that's happening, budget's not an issue. That game would be so hard to play through because it would just be massive, and like I would be overwhelmed personally. Like, what do you mean I have to like go grocery shopping on Timbuk 4? I don't know. I don't know. I'm just making up things. But one other thing I think video games or indie games do, besides speaking to a community that does not feel heard, I also think that because they're able to push the envelope, whether it's with storytelling, whether it's with gameplay, or whether it's with storytelling, gameplay, or even like visuals to an extent, because learning what visuals will stick with an audience, it shows the AAAs what's viable. Like, I would say with the rise of 2D indies again, 2D games are popular. When before,
they're popular again.
They're popular again. Before, in the late 90s into the early 2000s, it was a death sentence to have a 2D game unless you were on a handheld. You couldn't release a 2D game on a home console. That's a death now. Like no company would take that risk. Now, like, what is it? Capcom is Konami's re-releasing a lot of their old 2D Castlevania games. For crying out loud, Nintendo's bringing back Mario in a 2D format for a home console, not just their though they did that actually kind of for the Wii, now that I think about it. But it just kind of shows like these types of things are still popular. And also, even take out the 2D thing, like you also have different gameplay and narrative ideas, like the stories that focus on more into community, on whether it's inclusivity or solidarity or any of those things that like help someone from from a community that's marginalized feel more accepted. That's going to eventually bleed through to the AAA space, because if you can make an experience that speaks to people and it offers that for someone in a marginalized community, that's going to eventually reach the ears of AAA devs one way or another. It's going to be slow because all the higher ups are fucking greedy, but like it does reach there. And like even like look at like Outer Wilds. Like Outer Wilds is such an immensely complicated game for an indie title. Like the fact that everything happens in real time no matter where you're at. Like if you're on one planet, there are things happening on other planets in real time that you could be missing.
Crazy.
It's really impressive how they did that. I even think of how like the rise of games like Firewatch, walking sims.
That's I was about to tell you to mention those, because I think there are some indie games, of course, that focus more on gameplay or blend gameplay story, just like Outer Wilds does so brilliantly. But some other games like I don't know, the What Remains of Edith Finch,
Giant Sparrow,
or Gone Home.
Their previous game, the Unfinished Swan, also one of my favorite games of all time. I
played it,
could not believe.
But also
that
there
game.
are others. There's that Dragon Cancer, which I mean, I challenge anybody to go through that one and not shed a tear. Already at the third, pretty much at the third level. It's just so incredible, and it's an experience, and I think it's fine. I had kind of a not an argument, but at least kind of a very lively chat with someone at an indie game developers meetup in London just recently, and we were talking about gameplay as story, and I was telling him, so I have this podcast, and right now I'm writing a Metroidvania. I'm writing a Metroidvania. But he said, what do you mean you're writing a Metroidvania? Metroidvanias are gameplay. The story comes after. And I'm like, dude, do you know Hollow Knight, what it did with lore and how the two things came together? So that went on for a while. But there are, of course, games that try to put gameplay first. There are games that try to put gameplay and story first. And that's the kind of genre or type of game that I tend to enjoy the most. But there are also games that want to tell you a story, and they use video games as a medium to tell that story in an interactive and immersive way. Edith Finch and the ones that we've already mentioned. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's also interesting that some of those also delve into some critical cultural political moments, like there's Papers, Please. There's This War of Mine, which is so beautiful at telling you, at showing you what it means to live in a war zone, and having you live through that experience. I don't know how accurate that is, but it does hit you more than once, especially when your characters die permanently, and you're left with just maybe the child or something like that, left to survive on their own. But yeah, there's plenty of those experiences, and I think indie games do that very well, and AAAs are definitely starting to take notice. They will start to take more risks, especially after the umpteenth Assassin's Creed. Mirage looks like maybe something that came out 5 years ago, and the Twitch chat was full of, "Oh, this is bullshit. This is crap. Just do something new. It's the same old game. It's so boring." Same thing for Call of Duty. Same things for FIFA that apparently just came out, the new one, Football Club 2024, and it's shit because it's the same game but worse. So at some point, I think we will see some more cross-contamination between the two sectors, if you can call them sectors.
And I think you brought up an interesting point about what indie devs are able to focus on in terms of how they approach designing their games. I'm personally of the opinion that gameplay should always be the most important thing, because if you're playing a video game, and if you're not focusing on the gameplay, what's the difference between that and watching a movie then? Like, movies are able to tell stories. You need to find, and I'm not saying it has to be like every game has to be a shooter, or it has to have a puzzle, or it has to have some type of combat or action. But
yeah, and in fact, you mentioned Firewatch as being a great game, and that has very minimal gameplay, and the story works well together. So.
But I think the reason that one works is because while they did focus on story more than gameplay, they designed it in a way to allow what gameplay there was to reinforce the narrative. They told the story.
No, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, that's. I think that's what you were saying there. Yeah.
Well, and I think that the point I guess I'm trying to make is, like, if your gameplay is bad, even if the story is good, it's going to be a lot harder for people. Yeah. I think what I'm kind of getting on a little bit of a soapbox, I guess, where it's like, it always bothers me when people are like, "Well, story is more important than games." Than gameplay. I'm like, no. They should work together, but the reality of it is gameplay should always take precedence. I'm not saying gameplay should always be the focus. There's the difference. Yeah. Like Firewatch, the gameplay is not the focus. It is the story. However, gameplay should always take precedent in terms of being the foundation, because otherwise you don't have a game. I'm not even talking like it. Otherwise, like I said before, if you're just like, sorry, I'm going all over the damn place. Why do you think people criticize a lot of Kojima's later games as there's like hour and a half long cutscenes? That's not a cutscene. That's a movie. You're just watching a movie. And I'm sure the game is good. I'm sure the gameplay in between each of those movies is good. But that is a thing where it's like you're focusing more on the movie aspect, the storytelling aspect, than on the gameplay. When if you can marry the two, i.e. Firewatch, i.e. even like Hollow Knight, like you were saying, I'm personally not the biggest Hollow Knight fan, but that's more of a personal preference. But they married the two so well in that, and they focused on the gameplay as well, in my opinion, on that.
But again, Outer Wilds as well, gameplay excellent and story excellent, and the two reinforce each other. So, and of course, the gameplay has to be compelling first. But
and the gameplay doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't even have to be the focal point, but it has to be good. And that's really, like, that's why I'm saying, like, it, or at least passable. There are some games that have really janky gameplay that's just interesting enough that you can force your way through and to enjoy the story. But I think what indie games ultimately offer to the industry that doesn't really, what it offers to the industry is, besides inclusivity, which AAA devs are getting better at, they're not perfect by any stretch, but they are getting better at, besides exploring
Activision, but yeah.
Oh god. I said some, not all. Holy fuck, Activision. Anyway, there, besides the fact that indie games offer unique stories that you'll never hear otherwise, I think it's just that what indie games really offer is a way to kind of bring back almost the double A standard of games. Like, you know, back in the PS2 era and earlier, you could have your big AAA Final Fantasy X, you know, billions, or not billions, but millions of dollars in development. Or you could just spend a couple thousand, or however, you know, well, it's more than that, but you know what I'm saying, by comparison, a couple thousand. And you have this small bite-sized like game that you could, like, I'm thinking of even like Pa Rappa the Rapper for the PS1. Like that was, that was like, that wasn't a huge budget, you know, it's just a fun game that they decided like this would be a fun thing to do. And indie games offer that. Indie games have grown to the point where you still have, where it's kind of cool to see that they're still indie, but they're making games on par with double A level games. And it's really awesome to see.
I totally agree with everything, especially the bit about, you know, it's still a game, but you can use that as a medium to convey a message, to tell a story, to create an experience that people are going to enjoy. And but that, actually, what you said about indies today is actually a nice segue into the last, the fourth and final point of this chat of ours, which is, where are indies headed and how are they going to affect video game culture? Of course, it's difficult to know, and everybody, it's impossible to know for sure, and everybody's saying differently. It's either lying or a madman. But I think because of everything we said at the beginning and everything that's going on now, and this kind of interest from AAA in the indie game development scene, we're seeing some more investment into those small teams and those very focused little experiences that can focus on brevity and still give you a compelling game, or a compelling something to remember anyway. Game Pass, of course, has loads of indies in it, but Microsoft Studios, I mean, Microsoft is buying a lot of studios here and there, but like Ori and the Blind Forest is one of my favorite indie games of all time. Bought by Microsoft, founded by Microsoft, the Moon Studios. Apart from the music, that's just amazing, but the game itself is beautiful too. There's PlayStation Studios, and the PlayStation always pushing on indies. There's the EA original. So though I don't know where they're headed with that one now, I think they're refocusing a little bit. But the thing is, there's more and more publishers investing in small and passionate studios, and that means, as we mentioned, that the label indie is becoming nuanced and losing its meaning again, if it ever had any meaning. So, something for you personally, Josh. Where do you think we are headed there in terms of next steps in the impact on video game culture and all of that?
Well, I think one thing to bring up with where we're heading in the future, and I don't want to necessarily go into this because it's not 100% applicable to our topic today, but it does affect it, is AI in video games, and how AI art and, you know, all that stuff is going to affect game development. I'm of mixed opinions on the thing. I think AI could be a wonderful tool, but it's clearly not used as a wonderful tool by a lot of people. It's used to steal. It's used to do a number of awful things. So
it's used to save on costs, in a very brutal way. And, look at all the writers' strikes in the US right now. So, and of course you know about that because you're based there.
Yeah. And so it's just, I don't know enough about it to really comment on it, but you'd be dumb to not think it's going to affect how indie games are going to be in the future. It's going to. I don't know in what way. I'm not an indie dev. Nor am I really involved in the tech community on the AI half. I can say at least I'm not personally a fan of it, but I also think there can be a nuanced conversation about the uses of it and the ethics and morality of it. But that's not really, I don't feel qualified to be the one to discuss that. So
it's a very polarized conversation right now. There's either people saying, "Oh, it's the worst thing ever," or the gurus already jumping on it and saying, "Oh yeah, this is the future." As always, I think the truth stands in the middle. There's going to be great value in using AI tools for assistance and some kind of augmenting your work, but it's never going to replace you entirely, I think.
That's what I'm hoping as well. And personally, like, if it were up to me, I want AI gone. just personally from arts. Like AI is part of like I have no like at the job I work at, like we use AI to help basically move stuff along, but we haven't let anybody go. Essentially, AI just replaced hiring people, which you could argue is an issue in and of itself. But I don't necessarily have an issue with AI when it's used as a tool, but when it's used to wholesale replace people, that I have a major issue with. And so personally, I wish AI wasn't even a thing at all anymore, because I don't like the conversation. I don't like what it's doing. With that said, the genie's out of the bottle. You're not putting it back. It's not going away. It's here. So it sucks, but it's there. So but to get off that, that is something to keep in mind. That's going to affect the future of indie games. Just with the exception of that, I think where indie games are going is just kind of, they're going to continue to rise, man. Like there's going to be some indie studios that become AAA studios, not even necessarily bought up by Microsoft or Sony, though that could be a possibility. They're going to be indie studios that grow to be essentially the size of AAA. Like, hence it's not a perfect example because he started in a AAA studio and then ended up kind of creating his own. But Kojima with his production company, like, technically they're kind of indie, like we said at the beginning, but technically they're kind of not. It's kind of in between. But I think you're going to see the big indie developers grow and expand and become borderline AAA, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people will, like I said, and this time I do mean it in a derogatory sense, some people will get a little hipsterish about it, like, oh, they were cooler when they weren't so big, type of thing. But to each their own. That's everyone's gonna you do that with music, you do that with movies, you do that with everything. It was cooler when not as many people knew about it, type of thing. That's just human nature, and that's fine.
And also, as you grow, some culture issues arise, and if you become bigger, then you're going to lose a little bit of your nature, inevitably. But it doesn't mean that you become worse than what you were necessarily. So yeah.
But yeah, so where indie games going, I don't know. Like you said, we don't know 100% for sure. I just think that they're going to continue to grow because they have been for the last like 6 years. Like, they're just still growing, and they're still like, now some of the most anticipated titles, just period, are indie titles or sequels to indie games. I can't believe we didn't even touch on it.
I'll have to get the door, but let me go and get the door. I'll be right back. Well, I'm going to cut that out of the episode.
No worries.
But Amazon delivery just got a book about indie games, I think, coincidentally.
Nice.
But yeah, so I'll show it to you maybe later. But yeah, so sorry, you were saying.
Hold on, it's kind of on the tip of my tongue again. Oh, I can't believe we didn't even bring this up before. Supergiant, Bastion, Hades.
Oh, of course, yeah, Bastion, Hades.
Supergiant arguably they're not AAA, but they're pretty damn big now. No pun intended with the name Supergiant. But like they're a big indie developer. Excuse me. And I guess they publish certain games too. It's incredible what they've done, and you're going to see more Supergiants, more of these indie devs who are just so damn good at what they do that they don't necessarily they keep producing. I don't want to say hits, but like solid games. Like not everything's going to be the same level of a hit as Hades was. But it's still amazing with what they were able to do and where they started and where they are now. So I think indie devs and indie games are going to continue to rise. You're going to see the ones that have continued success to float to the top, and they're going to become bigger and better. And maybe some of their newer games, when they're larger, aren't going to hit you as well because they have too many people to kind of keep the ideas focused and concise. Who knows? But we won't know until we get there. So yeah, that's where I think indie games are going to go.
And I'm very aligned. I think they're going to keep rising. They're going to keep becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. They're going to keep growing in all sorts of ways, and we're going to see even more experimental things as things go on. There are so many indies out there that are already experimenting with game design and what they can do and the way they can send their message and such. and it's not going to stop. I mean, as to bring it back to the beginning, indie games and indie developers are the foundation of our medium. They've never left, and I think they never will. So to wrap it up, well, it was a beautiful conversation with you, Josh. Beautiful episode. We covered anything from the origins and rise of indie games to the future of video game culture. So, but it was really, really good, and I think this is going to be one of the best episodes of the show so far. So thank you so much for your time. And of course, one thing that I ask to everybody who comes on this show: where can people find you? And if they do, how can they support you?
Well, first off, thank you again for having me on. Honored once again to be your first other podcaster on the show. So really honored to have that privilege. So thank you. This was a really fun conversation. As usual, though, my mind after we're done recording is gonna be like, oh crap, did I say something I should have said over the whole course of the whole thing, or did someone misread in my intention? But that's anxiety for you. But I had a wonderful time, man. This was a lot of fun. For my own shenanigans, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Well, Twitter as long as it exists. Also Threads, because that's a thing now. Threads at Still Loading Pod on all of them. I'm over on Twitch at Still Loading Pod. I'm on YouTube at Still Loading Podcast, though YouTube is literally just audio and a thumbnail of all my episodes, so there's really not a whole lot going on over there. It's just something for fun on the side, just another place to put the podcast. So if you liked my voice and you want to hear more of it, or you didn't hate me too much for my opinions, feel free to check me out over there. And you can find Facebook, you can find Still Loading anywhere podcasts are found: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all that good stuff. So yeah.
And most of that is true for my podcast as well, for listeners who may be tuning in from Still Loading side. You can find the Indie Diarist on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, you name it. Also on Twitter, where I just reached the milestone of 1,000 followers yesterday. So that's great. And on Threads, where I just landed. And I think by the time this episode comes out, there will also be Patreon and Coffee, where you can support the show. So yeah, like you're the first person to hear that. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Josh. This was actually, we have something planned in the near future.
Yes, we do.
So yeah, people will hear from me again very soon. But yeah,
thank you.
Well, and that's a wrap on this special second bonus episode of the Indie Diarist podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to the show. As mentioned, you can find it on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere, and you're probably listening to it on a platform right now. Thank you so much to Josh for being such an amazing guest. I had so much fun, and this is one of the episodes I'm most proud of, really, even after listening to it while editing it. This is really amazing. Thank you so much. I can't wait to be on your show, which is going to happen pretty soon as well. So, as you heard, I was right. Patreon and Coffee are now live. As I mentioned also at the beginning of the episode, you can go to theindiediarist.com and find links to Discord, Twitter, everywhere where you can actually go and support the show. Every little thing counts, and I will be super appreciative of your support there. So yeah, if you're an indie game developer, as usual, please get in touch, because I would love to tell your story to my listeners who are always hungry for amazing human stories from the indie game development community. So until next time, I'll speak to you in the next episode of the Indie Diarist podcast.